Buenas, buenas. Welcome to our afternoon session. Bienvenidos a nuestra sesión de la tarde. Hoy vamos a estar empezando con un breve anuncio de nuestros intérpretes. We'll be starting with a brief announcement from our interpreters.
Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Susan y mi cointérprete es Aileen y representamos la Cooperativa de Justicia del Lenguaje Tilde. Estaremos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea entre el inglés y el español y nuestra misión es un mundo multilingüe donde todos los idiomas son respetados y valorados y donde la gente puede participar plenamente en los movimientos por la justicia social y la liberación colectiva.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Eileen and my co-interpreter is Susan. We represent Tilde Language Justice Cooperative and we'll be providing simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish. Our mission is a multilingual world where all languages are respected and valued and where people can fully participate in movements for social justice and collective liberation.
Si usted no es bilingüe, seleccione el canal de su idioma siguiendo las instrucciones en pantalla. Haga clic en el icono del globo para interpretación si usa una computadora o en los tres puntitos si está conectado por la aplicación de Zoom en su teléfono.
If you're not bilingual, follow the instructions on the screen to select your language channel. Click on the globe icon for interpretation if you are using a computer, or the three dots if you're connected by Zoom app on your phone.
This afternoon's presentation, la presentación de esta tarde será en inglés y en español. Les recomendamos a todas las personas monolingües escuchar a través de un canal de interpretación.
All these afternoon's presentations will be in English and Spanish, so we just want to remind you, if you're monolingual, to please choose a channel, English or Spanish.
Y creamos estos espacios multilingües entre todos. Por favor, entonces hablen despacio y claro, acercándose a su micrófono y que solo una persona hable a la vez.
We create these multilingual spaces together, so please speak slowly, clearly, and directly into your microphone, and only one person speak at a time.
Y gracias a la Comisión Latina sobre el SIDA y los organizadores de esta sesión por crear este espacio multilingüe.
And thank you to the Latino Commission on AIDS and the organizers of this session for creating this multilingual space.
Gracias, thank you, and it's back to you all.
Thank you, interpreters. Gracias, intérpretes. It looks like our interpretation is now live. I'll give it a second. While folks transition, parece que nuestra interpretación ya está en vivo. All right, so welcome to this fabulous lineup. I am so excited for this roundtable with new and old seasoned friends, I'll say, to talk about language justice, legacies, realities, and futures. We're joined by Ada Volkmer, the Language Justice Circles Coordinator at the Center for Participatory Change, co-founder and wonderful podcast extraordinaire at Escucha. Wonderful to have you here, Ada. Hi.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi. And we're also joined by Mara Youdelman. And Youdelman, is that correct? Youdelman? My apologies.
It's good enough.
Okay, thank you. Managing attorney at the National Health Law Project, which I am so grateful to have you here to really bring that kind of like federal perspective and legislative perspective into the conversation. First, I saw Mara in action in over the summer, where she was presenting about what just happened and changes to the Affordable Care Act and how those are changing how we might understand language moving forward in this country. And we have the wonderful Dr. April Baker Bell joining us from Michigan State University up north, but somebody who has been working in the South as well and meeting with folks across the South to really have some wonderful and radical conversations around language, author of Linguistic Liberation, as well as the founder of the Black Language Syllabus, which just went live over the summer. So thank you for being here, April. I'm going to go ahead and start by giving y'all the floor for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how you feel, to just talk to us a little bit about what work you're currently engaged in and a little bit about how you understand language and language justice. So if we can start, I'll pass it over to Mara, if you'd like to begin. Does that sound good?
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate this afternoon. I'm very excited to join everyone. So I work at the National Health Law Program. We are a nonprofit public interest organization, and I'm in our Washington, D.C. office. We work on access and quality of healthcare for low-income and underserved populations. National Health Law Program, or NHELP, is 50 years old, and we've been working on language access issues for probably almost that entire time. I've been with NHELP about 20 years now, and I started very soon after President Clinton issued an executive order that refocused attention on civil rights requirements to provide language access and prevent discrimination against people who were limited or not English speakers. So I've been working on these issues for 20 years. I've seen some progress, and yet we have a long, long way to go. One of the issues that I think we've been seeing more recently is a focus on a provision of the Affordable Care Act. Sometimes you'll hear it called Section 1557, which is the actual section in the law that brought this provision into being. You can also call it the Healthcare Rights Law. And what Section 1557 does is it says you can't discriminate on the basis of race, color is how the law refers to it, or ethnicity, national origin, sex, disability, and age. Now, you don't hear language access in that statute, but what actually it says, if you can't discriminate on the basis of national origin, that means you can't discriminate on the basis of language. So you can't provide less services or worse services to someone just because they might not be fluent in English. And so we've been spending an awful lot of time making sure that people understand what that law is, and that it's not just sort of on paper, but it actually means something in practice. Now, unfortunately, this administration has tried to really undermine this part of the Affordable Care Act, as well as lots of other pieces of the Affordable Care Act. But in particular, they recently sort of changed the rules that the administration was using to implement this provision of the law. But the law remains on the books, and so it's very important that everyone knows that whether it's on language or on race or on their age or disability, you can't suffer discrimination in the healthcare settings. And if you do, you actually have remedies so that you can file complaints with the Office for Civil Rights, and you can sort of work on education. A lot of states actually have their own state laws requiring language access. One of the things that we updated a couple of years ago was a 50-state survey. So you can actually go onto our website and look for your state. What are your state laws that require language access? That may actually be more comprehensive than some of the federal laws. So a lot of what we're trying to do, and this will just wrap up my intro, but at the federal level, so we're really trying to make sure that we maintain these strong civil rights and non-discrimination provisions, that we look for ways to enhance language access. So for example, there's been some work around the coronavirus and COVID, of how do we make sure that all of the messaging coming out from federal agencies like the Centers for Disease Control is also produced in non-English languages. It's really important when we're in the middle of a pandemic that everyone can understand what is happening and what they need to do so that we're all protected. We're also trying to work on funding issues, because often language access can sort of be that ugly stepchild in healthcare. That, you know, the hospital is willing to, you know, have their MRI machine and their X-ray machine, but they're not always thinking of needing to have interpreters. So a lot of it is also around funding. How do we make sure that the money is there to help pay for interpreters and pay for translated materials to ensure language access? So very briefly, I do a lot of work at the federal level of trying to improve the laws and the policies to ensure that language access is available and that people aren't suffering discrimination just because they're not fluent in English. And so I'll leave it at that to start.
Absolutely, and thank you for building us, taking us there, right, to think about what the stakes are when we're actually talking about language access, and how this has been shifting, because we know that those struggles are sometimes hard to understand. The Affordable Care Act, I believe, is multiple thousands of pages, so actually expecting so many of our community members to be able to access it is hard, right? And so we need more champions like you on the inside. And I know that somebody who has been championing conversations around language access and justice in the South has been my dear friend Ada, who has really been helping us evolve what we think about when we're saying language access. So Ada, I'll pass the floor to you.
Awesome. I'm going to start with a little music. This is our podcast intro song. I'm super nervous, and I normally think of myself as someone that can like speak in public, but I'm just so honored to be on here with you all. I know that there are some like badass folks on this panel, some badass folks in the chat, and so I'm just really honored and want to thank José, want to thank the commission, want to thank Mara and April for allowing me to be on this panel with you all. I am Ada Volkmer. I am in Asheville, North Carolina. I am the co-host, or no, now I'm the host. I was the co-host. Now I'm the host of a language justice podcast called Se Escucha. And Mara, I wanted to say that the first time that I held a mic was at a workshop about Title VI. The interpreter didn't show up, and someone came with the interpretation equipment and gave me the mic and said, you grew up on the border, because I grew up between Mexico and Texas. They said, you grew up on the border, you do this. And I was like, I can't do this. And plus Title VI, right? And then I grabbed the mic and then I was like, I can't do this, I can. So it was my first interpreting gig in the early 2000s. So Se Escucha is a language justice podcast. And we think about language justice in all of its forms. We think about language justice as interpreting. We think about language justice as language loss and language reclamation. We think about language justice as queering language. We think about language justice as, I think the podcast is really trying to figure out everything that language justice can be, because I think we used to think that language justice was like access and having translators and having interpreters. And the podcast really is thinking about all of the things that can be language justice. So how is, broken, quote unquote, broken North Carolina Spanglish language, part of language justice? How is Black ASL part of language justice? How is AAVE part of language justice? The podcast is really trying to like widen as much as we can. And I'll just say that the podcast grew out of a curriculum. So I'm an interpreter, I'm an English-Spanish interpreter, and I grew up in kind of this like social justice movement interpreting. And my friend Andrea Golden and I, when we started the podcast, we had just printed out this interpreter training manual. So we had just kind of like printed, edited again, put on the website. We had just finished putting out this, like, how do you train language justice interpreters manual? And as soon as we printed the manual, we were like, nope, I wouldn't say that anymore. Nope, that's irrelevant. Actually, I've grown in my thinking in this part. Oh, actually, that part embarrasses me. And we didn't want to just keep updating this book. And so we thought a podcast can be a way that we can continue the conversation. And so that's where Se Escucha, which means seen and heard, that's where the podcast was born. How do we continue this conversation? And how do we open it up to more folks? So I'm super excited to be here, and I'm really excited about this combo.
Yes, I'm excited to have you here, Ada. And the interpreters that have come through this language justice curriculum, of which we put a link in the chat, are also some of the folks who first made me think about how we need to have like tea and herbs and essential oils in our spaces, all of these different kind of somatic and embodied ways of being able to think about what helps us talk and communicate with each other. And because we know that so much of it is more than just the specific language you're speaking, right? And I think somebody that has been really motivating me to think about this more profoundly, and to that anything you say has just been like nothing but gems, is definitely Dr. April Baker Bell. I'd like to turn the floor to you to talk to us a little bit about your work and what you've been, the wonderful work you've been up to.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm nervous too. I am too, because this is a new space, but I'm really excited to be in conversation with you and Mara and the community that's here. So when I think about my work, I'm trying to think about like the best way to like talk about it, but I like to think of myself as a transdisciplinary language and literacy researcher and activist. You know, I came into this work from being a teacher in Detroit and realizing I was ill prepared, you know, to work with diverse languages in and through education. I taught in Detroit. I'm a native Detroiter. I speak Black language or African-American language. And when I came into the classroom to teach with my students, and we were talking about standard English, the students immediately were resistant to it because they felt that they were being forced to be part of a linguistic community that they were not part of. And so I remember this conversation happening with these high schoolers, and though like my cultural competence could relate to them, I was not prepared to enter a classroom to think beyond white linguistic cultural practices and norms, which was a huge problem. And so that was the beginning of my work. And once I started getting into the research, I realized that there was a history of work looking at Black language in particular that I had no idea about, yet I was teaching Black kids in a classroom. That was a huge problem for me. And so at the center of my work, I think about the intersections between language, race, and racism, because a lot of the pedagogies that did, you know, think about, you know, language never got to the intersections of what we're calling linguistic racism, right? It was always about how to teach children of color, Black children, brown children, how to accommodate racism that we see embedded in our schools, in our curriculums, in our everyday experiences. And I find that very challenging because when I was doing my teaching and researching with students, I was being met with, we want to talk about beyond the technical differences between languages, right? We want to talk about more than code switching. In fact, it was, and what really helped me to begin thinking about this notion of anti-Black linguistic racism that I forwarded in my book, Linguistic Justice, was in 2012, I was doing research in a classroom, and the students were thinking about the situation between George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, and the children critiqued it because they said, standard English, we are often told that it's meant to lead to our survival or to give us access. But Trayvon Martin said, why are you following me to George Zimmerman and he was still murdered? And if that would sound like standard English to us, if that didn't save his life, then how is this a method of survival? So that became the very intersections of my work, thinking about what we're seeing around the world that's happening now, the type of oppression and the racial violence that's happening with communities in color. We need to talk about that conversation. We need to use that conversation to kind of challenge these approaches that we're taught will lead to survival or give us access. Particularly when we're looking at an administration, we have a president in office, and I don't get into language shaming, who cannot communicate in the way, the standards that we use for children in schools and everywhere else this president can't even meet those standards. So that shows us the very root of white linguistic supremacy and what we're doing. And so I work against that in my work. In my book, I think about pedagogy and I think about curriculum. And so what I argue for is that children need to know more than just talking about these linguistic differences, but how do we teach them the history of language? How do we talk about the intersections of language and race and racism? How are we talking to them about all of these other things that are also part of language? Because what we're seeing happening in schools is not even leading up to the very things that we're asking for. And so my book takes a different approach, because what we tend not to know, and I'm talking about Black language in particular at this moment, is that history, the history of enslavement and how language planning was intentionally used to capture enslaved Africans from their homelands and to put them into communities where they're not communicating in the same language, and to bring them to this nation in a way. And they created a language out of remnants of their mother tongue, West African languages, and the English language to create what we see here now today. They were denied access to literacy by law. And now the very language that was created, they are being used and oppressed with. So that's what I think about in my work. Recently, I started thinking about beyond education, because I have people reading my book in the community that are not, they're not teachers, they are not in school, but they talk to me about how important this work is beyond schools. And so my colleague, Dr. Carmen Kennard, and I came up with the Black language syllabus because we wanted this conversation to reach more people. We wanted it to reach the community. We wanted to think of this as a community education type of outlet. I don't know if I can share my screen or if I'm going over. I was going to quickly show the Black language syllabus.
Oh, please feel free. Yes. We dropped a link in the chat. Do you have the share screen option on your Zoom?
Yeah, it says the host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Okay. You know how this be. So give me 1 second. If you'd like, I can share my screen and then you can walk us through the website a little.
I gave you access, Dr. Baker-Bell.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay, I have access here. So I'm just going to share this and just briefly show it to you all, because I know, Jose, this is what you really wanted me to show. So this is the Black language syllabus. And, we welcome so many different groups. And like we mentioned here, we created this space because we cannot rely on institutions to give us access and learn the things that we need to know to understand and have a read of what's happening around us in the world. And for me, I'm talking about this anti-Black linguistic racism. So here it's like a resource page where we recently wrote demands for Black linguistic justice with one of our professional organizations. We have the list of demands here and the type of things that we're calling for. We created the Black language homework section. And so if you want to come and get, and to learn more about this conversation that we're having, you don't have to go purchase a book or to have access to some type of library that's associated with institutions. We wanted to provide the access here. So this is a space where you can come and learn about, we have Black language in education, Black language in young adult literature, Black language in hip hop, Black rhetoric, these other political conversations that we need to be having around language. We also have a Black language magazine. I'm sorry. Let me try to cut this off. We want to bring the culture and everything in it. So the Black language magazine, what we believe is going to be one of the most popular parts of the site, or what we hope people will come back to, is it's a magazine which we invite people from all walks of life to be able to, if you want to contribute a piece to it, if that's an article, if that's a blog, if that's some type of drawing, some type of poetry, and you want to be featured in a magazine, we have a magazine here, and where we're having conversations about the very things that we're talking about on this panel. We have featured videos. Again, and we hope that, even people that's part of this roundtable will consider, having a conversation in this type of space where more people have access than just academia or other institutions, but we really want to be able to engage, the community around this idea of linguistic justice more broadly, because we do think about linguistic justice more broadly, but Black linguistic justice specifically, because when we're talking about even conversations about like limited English access and all of these things, honestly, Black language is not even considered in that conversation. It's often not considered in conversations of bilingualism. What I mean is in schools and in other spaces, because oftentimes it's just seen as broken English. You know what I mean? It's not a real language in the first place. You know, that's just the way Black people talk because they're unintelligent. And with the history, you know, of this work around Black language, we just wanted to have a space where we're talking specifically about this, you know, Black linguistic justice. So I'll stop there because I feel like I've talked too much. Thank you.
Nothing but gems. We're so grateful for this and for this blessing, really, that you have given to the community for free, right? At least to them and through your own labor. And I appreciate you mentioning the phrase limited English proficiency. That's something that I think many of us have seen who work in the linguistic field, and wanted to open it up to hear if Mara or Ada, if y'all wanted to offer any reflections on that phrase as well. I think it's often used for being able to make the case for certain changes. And then, so I think maybe walking us through some of that descriptor and how, with the impact it's had.
So I can start, I think, and I'd say it's got the historical baggage to some degree in exactly what Dr. Baker-Bell was speaking about of, you know, it has been limited in its focus. The idea, and this stems from, and I'm a lawyer, and so I work with the legal constructs that I have because that's what my organization mostly focuses on, and that's what I do. And there is inherent institutional and structural racism for centuries in our institutions and in particularly the law. So I'm going to speak with that frame to just start with. The second frame is we do have civil rights laws, but they tend to be limited. So, you know, we start with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is where the issues that I've been talking about in terms of language access for limited English proficient individuals started. And the focus there was really on individuals who spoke non-English languages, but mostly foreign languages. So whether it's Spanish or Swahili or Tagalog or Mandarin or, you know, you name your language, that's been the focus. It hasn't been the issues that Dr. Baker-Bell was speaking about. So in that context, when we say that someone's limited English proficient, the way it's been understood is sort of in a context of how well do you speak English? And again, according to certain cultural norms that this country has been abiding by. So the census asks a question, how well do you speak English? And it says, do you speak English very well, not at all? Individual self-identify. In the healthcare context, which is my area of focus, we generally say if someone doesn't speak English very well, that they're often going to have difficulty communicating effectively in the healthcare context. Now, the issue of healthcare literacy is a whole other angle that, you know, we could get into and spend a whole lot of time on, because there are plenty of people in the United States for whom English is their primary language. And I say primary, not necessarily first, but primary language, who still cannot understand what's happening in the healthcare encounters because of the level of complexity and terminology that we use. And then if you're speaking a non-English language, and let's just use Spanish as an example, I've had medical professionals who sort of explain, if you're in a healthcare setting and you speak Spanish, you need to know English, Spanish, and medical Spanish. And it's very rare that a lot of people who are, you know, English speakers, let alone non-English speakers, are going to have the level of knowledge of the complex terminology to be able to understand and make informed decisions and be able to communicate effectively about their treatment options and understand follow-up and medication regimens and things like that. So when we add a foreign language on top of it, we're sort of adding complexity, but I want to be very clear that this is also an issue that most individuals in this country have low health literacy to start with. And then if you add the complexity of not speaking English very well according to these constructs, that's when you might need an interpreter to assist if it's a foreign language, a sign language interpreter, other communication assistance for people who might have hearing impairments but might not speak sign language, large print for people with visual impairments. There's sort of a whole range. I mean, my area of focus really is on the foreign language side of things, but it's a much more complex issue that comes into play in many different ways.
Thank you. And also thank you for mentioning the census. We know earlier we announced that the census date was originally September 30th, but it has been moved to October 5th, we believe, for folks to still be able to submit their census data. But that's a good reminder, right, of like how that, even with that information, how we're going to be able to work with it moving forward. Ada?
I'll just say really briefly that when you sent us this question in preparing us, I was like, wow, limited English proficiency is something that I really have no experience with. This phrase is something that like I don't have a lot of experience with it. And I think that part of that has to do with the way that I grew up, kind of like this unique experience that I had growing up on the US border, not remembering what it was like to not speak English and Spanish. So my parents say that I would be like, rah, 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 rah. And they'd be like, what's that? And I was like, that's English. Oh, eso es inglés. So this idea, I grew up in this place where it was just like English, Spanish, Spanglish all the time. Everybody I knew spoke both. And then coming into the world of interpreting and coming into the world of language justice, because most of my work has always been in English and Spanish. Like I've always been in that privileged place of like, I understand, in the English and Spanish world, I understand everything that's happening. So you just sent me into this spin of like, why don't I know more about limited English proficiency? So I'm curious to, thank you, Mara, for sharing. And yeah, there's definitely people that can say more things about this than me.
No, I think maybe a spiritual allergic reaction, which, understandable to some degree, right? And I appreciate you for mentioning also your family, right, and how that can shape how we understand language. And I wanted to ask if y'all would be interested in sharing as well who some of your, linguistic ancestors or people who kind of inspired you to do this work are around language. I know that many of us have different people who maybe were great storytellers growing up, or just we had an educator or somebody that we witnessed doing it. So wanted to open that up and see if y'all could share some of your linguistic ancestors, so to speak.
I'll start. When I think about my mother as my linguistic role model, I grew up and the thing about it is that when you grow up in spaces where the language is valued, in your community space, in your family, in your culture, my mom was always, my linguistic role model because of the ways that she could use Black language. And so, okay, it's weird. I'm looking at myself on a screen. So let me change the gallery view. But I would say it was my mom, and I think always having the way language was used in my home, to fall back on always kind of helped me shape the way I think about language and how I view the world. We were never in a home told that we needed to change parts of ourselves in order to be successful. That just was not like a type of philosophy we came up under. I understand why people in certain households would have that conversation, given the type of linguistic oppression that's experienced in schools and society, why they would do that. But that just was not the way I was raised. And so, and I think that was the best thing that my parents could do for me. I had an appreciation of all types of languages. I had an understanding at a very young age that people communicate very differently, but that doesn't mean that this person is less intelligent or inferior in comparison to anyone else. So I think that's the kind of motivation that always drove. That's why I was able to hear my students when they disagree with the type of practices that are traditionally used in classrooms. That's the way when I approached and went to a predominantly white institution for the first time, the way I felt the type of things that were happening were very different from my community in relation to language. I felt that on my body, and so I just read the world that way. But separate from that, I would say in the work, I have to go to Geneva Smitherman, who was actually an advisor of mine, but she's an international and nationally known scholar of Black language. And the conversations that I'm talking about now around Black linguistic justice is not new. And I think that's the problem for me. It's, if I look into the history, of these conversations, these are fights that have been going on for a very long time. And Dr. Geneva Smitherman was at the, she was at the height of that fight, during the civil rights movement, during the Black Power movement. She was at the height of that fight, saying some of the same things that I am saying, making some of the same arguments that I'm saying. And these conversations happened before I was born. There's one particular case, the Ann Arbor Black English case, that happened right in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where Black parents sued the Ann Arbor School District because they were not taking Black children's language into consideration, and the children were not, they were not being educated, essentially. And the parents sued that school district. And so the type of things that we're talking about in education, it's real. Like, there are actual cases to support the kind of things that we're talking about, yet it still goes on. So I think she inspires me. And I think about my own mother to continue this fight, even in this moment in history, because, when I look at the history of this conversation, I think that it's just, it's really upsetting and disheartening, that we are fighting about some of the very same things, that we are not educating, I think, many children, that we have a gatekeeping mechanism system set up in our schools that honors, again, only white linguistic and cultural norms. And it's being used as the golden standard that everyone is measured by. And then, so when we talk about these conversations of these gaps in learnings, or like, Black and brown children are not, learning at the same levels, or they're not passing these tests. Well, if a test, if the test centered those children's language practices and norms, they would be ahead, right? Like, if, white students have a heads up because their language literacies, histories are what's privileged in schools. And so they walk right in without a challenge. Whereas other children who are not part of those, that system, are going to have a difficult time, of course. And, so that's why this fight is so important. But I'm so thankful for my ancestors before Dr. Geneva Smitherman, before my mother, who were part of it. And I think that's what inspired me to keep on, no matter how hard it is. And this work is not easy, because, I've been approached, especially just recently in this current moment. I've received death threats because I'm arguing for language justice. I've received, harassment, people sending me emails, to Michigan State and say, you should be fired for what you're fighting for. But I'm thankful for, my ancestors that came before me, because I know that is just part of it, right? But it inspires me to keep going on. So took you all around the corner to bring you back to that, to answer that, but that's what inspired me to keep going.
Yes, definitely. And, I know that I speak for all of us on the coordinating team, and I'm sure on this panel that we have your back with being able to stand up against that xenophobia and racism that you're confronting while raising your voice about this, and definitely building on that legacy that you're sharing and doing justice to it. But did want to hear from Ada and Mara as well about how y'all have been thinking about legacy, because we know that's where so many of us get our strength, right, to be able to continue to express solidarity and show up in this work. Ada or Mara.
Pues si voy a hablar de mis ancestros, entonces prefiero hablar en español. Entonces invito a las compas en el panel que hagan clic en el globo de interpretación. Yo era esa niña que mis papás batallaron conmigo en que yo hablara español. A mí me estaban mandando a la escuela en los Estados Unidos y todos los días cruzaba un puente para ir a la escuela, y cuando llegaba a la casa yo era esa niña que batallaba en hablar completamente en español. Y mis papás me decían, no te entendemos, en esta casa se habla español, no hables inglés. Entonces es irónico que ahora a estas alturas soy como que intérprete y parte de esta lucha por la justicia del lenguaje. Pero quiero decir que yo soy estudiante de Alice Johnson, yo soy estudiante de Andrea Arias, yo soy estudiante de Roberto Tijerina, yo soy comadre y estudiante de Andrea Golden, y soy producto del Centro Highlander, el Centro de Educación Popular Highlander en Tennessee, que fue el lugar donde yo crecí como intérprete y como trabajadora de justicia del lenguaje.
Mara, would you like to share as well?
Sure. I'll speak a little bit from a different perspective, because I think for me, I'm a white woman who grew up in privilege and didn't have to face a lot of these issues growing up, to be perfectly honest. So I certainly appreciate my ancestors and the challenges they faced when they immigrated to this country in the early 1900s. But I think it's a slightly different answer. For me, what brought me to this work on doing language access, and I love the phrase language justice, which I want to think about and my framing now from using the law in a certain way, was the overall issue of civil rights and justice. And how do we ensure that everyone has the opportunities that this country promises, but doesn't always come through with? And so I look back over my 20 years of working on language access and think of all of the interpreters that I've met and the translators that I've met and the people fighting day to day to get the services that are needed for their patients, for their family members, for their communities. That's what drives me to continue doing this work. And, you know, I could name names and I'd forget a bunch of names, but there are literally interpreters, translators, interpreter managers all over this country who I've met over the years who are just my role models in this work, because day in and day out, they've been doing it sometimes since childhood, sometimes in their professional lives, often in their personal lives. And what they are struggling every day to achieve in this uphill battle is amazing. And so I draw strength coming from a place of privilege that I have been lucky enough to use the skills and the knowledge and the education that I have been able to obtain to do my little tiny part. And to help support and to try to find ways to somewhat work within the system to see if we can improve things, as much as everyone has to work day to day just to struggle to get access to healthcare or access to other services. So I think I take it differently, just, you know, because of, unfortunately, you know, not unfortunately, but, you know, who I am and how I grew up in this. But I hope that that sort of answers the question in a different way. And really honor and appreciate everyone who has helped me learn about these issues and their struggles so that I can hopefully try to make that difference myself.
Definitely. And we know that this is lifelong work, right? Something we say in Southerners on New Ground, which is an org that I'm associated with, is that we want to be transformed in the service of the work. And I think that's something that I carry with me, right, as I continue to learn. And I am curious to hear from y'all, because we sometimes don't have spaces to brainstorm together or just kind of like float ideas, and to take advantage of a few minutes to and invite our participants as well who are listening in. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A feature. And while y'all are doing that, if y'all could reflect for us on how you all might see access, justice, liberation, like these different words kind of coalescing, collaborating, what work they might do. You know, I was socialized into you know, this lineage, some of this lineage that I've mentioned, where I was thinking of language justice, right? And then April got me to start thinking about liberation, and I think that that's right? Like, and some of that comes from like the different movements we're in, and I know that Mara, you just mentioned, you know, justice might be something that actually might resonate with lawyers, or maybe it might not, you know. And I'd be curious to hear what y'all think about that and how we might be able to move forward from that.
I think, you know, when I think about the liberation aspect, thank you for generating, you know, such thoughtful questions and an amazing conversation. You know, what for me, what it was that led me to think about liberation was I started asking different questions from students and different questions of my research. You know, if we move beyond just like, we understand on the other side of this, right? There are expectations for language, and, you know, we tend to think about things as access, right? Even though sometimes what we think is access really does not lead to access. But so we know that conversation. And I think what I was looking at is for years, we've been trying to, I'm thinking from an education aspect, we've been trying to, get, Black language speakers to communicate in the standard language so that they could get access. But the questions we weren't asking students, like, how are you experiencing this pedagogy though? Like, how are you experiencing the work that's happening in schools? We hear less about that. So I shifted my questions. I just became more concerned about what are they feeling based on what they're telling me. And that's when I got to a lot of, the students I was working with began talking about how painful it is. One of the students, in fact, said, I felt like my teachers were trying to scrutinize me. Like when I was younger, I would come home and I would cry all the time. There is another student that said, I never know what I'm doing wrong, right? Because for Black language speakers, some of the things within our linguistic community, like a habitual be, or, the particular grammatical and rhetorical features, it sounds like English, right? But the structure is very different, you know what I mean? And so what their teachers were doing were honing in on these differences that the students could not tell, because the teachers were ill prepared to tell the students, here are the features of your language that you're communicating in. So even if the goal was to code switch or to communicate in a way, like that wasn't happening because the teachers are ill prepared. So the students, really were having a difficult time. And then I began to talk to elders like my mother, who would remember and recall moments in school when her language was being policed. You know what I mean? When she was made to feel inferior, when she was made to feel stupid, essentially. For me, that is the part that my work took a shift, because I began thinking, well, what do we need to work against that type of violence? And for me, it began, why don't we talk about the history of our language and how it came about? Why don't we talk about its connections to enslavement and why this country operates the way it does, right? What happens in school, we're just thinking about, you need to speak this way. If you want to get into college, if you want to get into here, as if colleges aren't racist, right? As if you're not going to experience that same thing, as if somehow that's paradise over there, you know what I mean? And this type of racism and white supremacy exists on the outside of that. So the students aren't getting the full picture, right? They're not able to think about their racial realities in connection with the pedagogies and connections with their language. So that became the shift in my work, to talk about those intersections, to give students the language to name their experiences, to be able to understand power, right? How power and language operates with one another. And that does something different to the soul. Because even if someone's correcting you, even if someone thinks your language is inferior, when you can point out that this is just part of the white supremacist institution that this country was built on, that gives you a different way in, a different window into thinking about the work. And so for me, that's how I think about those things intersecting. So my work became less about the right pedagogy, less about changing the student, and more about let's change the systems. Let's also dismantle these systems that harm everyone, that only, while the rest of the world are able to walk into schools and not experience oppression, the rest of us are being oppressed. We have to shift that. And I think if we're not giving students those tools, those windows into these conversations, we are going to keep operating under the same system that continues to exist. And 50 years from now, we're going to have some language justice people doing the same thing that we're doing. So I think we have to readjust and kind of think about these systems and what is the work to dismantle that.
And I would sort of add on to that, having done this work now just for 20 years, I see lots of focus originally, and then it ebbs and flows and it falls off the radar screen, and then it comes back, and then it goes away and it comes back. And so I think that piece of how do we address the systems is so critical. And that is an area I've been trying to focus on. And it's a challenge because, again, what I see in the healthcare arena is language services ends up being an added service. When there's enough money in the system, people can get interpreters easily. And then when there's healthcare cuts, people are asked to bring their own interpreters or their family members who often don't have that capacity in that medical terminology in both English and a non-English language, and an understanding of what an interpreter has to do. And they, don't interpret everything that's there, and you can miss things, and medical history gets messed up, and there's so many implications. So I work within the systems, because that's, as a lawyer and working in DC with Congress and the administration, that's how I do it. And some of the things we've been trying to do is address, for example, the funding issue. Why doesn't Medicare pay for language services? Okay, so we have these civil rights laws which say you can't discriminate. But if there's no funding, what makes a healthcare provider hire an interpreter, translate materials, get, non-English, videos or other things? And the same thing could be, say, in private insurance and in Medicaid and CHIP. So that is where we're trying, from a policy perspective and a legal perspective, how do we get better laws, policies, funding in place? It's not the be-all, end-all. But if we're stuck with the systems we have until we can change the systems, how can we try to help make the systems at least work better for the people who need it? So it's a step, and I've been trying, we've been doing baby steps for 20 years, but we're going to keep trying. At the same time, I think we're trying to just reform the institutions as well.
I think this makes me think about people being able to express themselves. And for me, that means people being able to express themselves with their healthcare provider, express themselves with their therapist, their family, their loved ones, at work, and to really be able to express themselves, in the way that they choose, in the way that, in the way that comes from their heart. And for some of us, that's kind of conflicting. Like, what is the language that comes from my heart? It depends who's receiving this language. But that's part of it too, right? Is the ability to express ourselves. And I want to bring in, a week ago today, many of us lost a colleague and comrade, Alandria Williams. Alandria was the first person who really told me, kind of like, what is language justice doing to connect with Black immigrants? What is the language justice movement doing to connect with Black immigrants? What is the language justice movement doing to connect with monolingual Black people in the United States who don't speak, foreign languages? The first person who was like, right, but where's the Black interpreter? And I was like, yes, you're right, Alandria. So I just want to bring in some of Alandria's words. She said, language justice is necessary if we are going to build a broader movement for change, and is essential for communities to talk to each other across the world and across the street. So I have that in my heart when I'm with you all today.
Thank you for naming that, and for naming that legacy, and for all of you for telling us a little bit about this journey, right, to help really ground us in your work. And a phrase that I recently heard from a Mi Gente member, and Mi Gente gave our opening session this morning, was ancestral futurism, which is that we actually want to be able to have ancestors in the future, right? And that's some of what we want to be able to do, right? And I think that's part of the legacy that y'all are building for us, right? Being able to get more investment in this work, being able to give us the right framework, the right tools, and connect us with the right people. And so I really appreciate y'all for doing that. I wanted to also, because part of my facilitation practice is inviting y'all to see if y'all have any questions for each other, right? Is there anything that y'all might want to ask each other during this time? We did have one question in the chat that I think was answered live, so I think that's perfect. But yeah, do y'all have any questions for each other you might want to lift up?
I mean, I just want to connect. I just think I think we could do some really badass work if we connected across the three. I mean, I just enjoyed the conversation and enjoyed learning, about these, different efforts toward language justice, these, especially listening to what's happening, how it's understood in the legal world, because that's sometimes a disconnect, you know what I mean? Because you just don't know what's happening. And as far as, like the discourse, like right now I'm being, I've been invited to work with these researchers and thinking about language and medicine, you know, because like, I think Mari, someone pointed out that, you know, language is usually not part of the broader conversations, even when we're talking about things related to racism, things related to discrimination, language is not thought of. And so they don't have that there. And they were talking about a lot of, I think, out of what you were saying, the interactions, you know, even at hospitals between patient and provider, you know what I mean? Not having interpreters, but also like that the doctors are not even prepared to listen to what's happening and how that creates so many health issues. And so now they're wanting me to like think about language through that lens, but I don't understand medicine very well. So I have some learning to do, but it would just be interested to see an intersectional conversation, I think, across law, education, medicine, community. I think it will really allow us to push the work forward and to use your phrase, you know, where we see ancestors in the future. I think that this is the way that we see ancestors across communities in the future, is to intersect and collaborate to fight toward, you know, language justice. That wasn't a question, but that's.
No, that you took us there, yes. Absolutely. Yeah, and want to just really thank y'all. I wanted to mention right now also, since it is apropos, that our roundtable after this is actually going to be about the Language Justice Institute that the Latino Commission on AIDS has been, and through our Latinos in the South program that I, Judy, and Joaquin have been coordinating over the last few months. Some of those fellows are listening in right now, actually, and that is a program where we explicitly connected folks to agencies to talk about how they can build language justice in healthcare spaces. Yes.
And before we go, I want to say that tomorrow we launch the 3rd season of the podcast. A new episode is dropping tomorrow, and our very special guest is the very one and only José Romero. So
you didn't tell me you were going to announce that right now.
So tomorrow, iTunes, Spotify, José gifted us with an excellent interview. So check it out.
Yes, and please, if y'all want to give a shout out, actually, to some other things that y'all have on the agenda, on your horizon, please, now would be a great time to do so. Either upcoming episodes, events, or any legislative battles, or anything that you might want us to. I mean, there's an election coming up, but anything that y'all might want to signal for us.
I would just say, in terms of legislative, find out what's happening in your state. Find out what the opportunities are. Communicate with your members of Congress and your state legislators about the importance of language justice and language access, and getting laws and policies on the books where they aren't there, funding, and just to make sure, and there's enforcement of the civil rights law. So educate yourselves and educate your policymakers about what's been done, what needs to be done, and where we need to all go together.
Yes, and maybe this roundtable can be repeated as a Se Escucha podcast episode in the future. Well, dreamy y'all, thank you. I think we're at time. Really appreciate y'all for joining us for this roundtable. We're going to enter into a 15-minute break before our next session. Please join us if you can. You can find the link in the chat or on our Latinos in the Deep South Facebook page. Please. Thank you all so much. And thank you, yes, to our interpreters. But everybody, thank you so much. April, Mara, and Ada, y'all are dreamy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Gracias.
Yeah.
All right. See y'all at 2:15. Link in the chat.
Bye.